Welcome to the live weekly update. Is it July 1st, 2026? We've made it through June. This was a big milestone for me. June was the month that I wanted to get through because I knew that it was going to be a really important timestamp on a very long process. So I haven't done a couple of lives for a couple of weeks, trying to catch up and prepare for the biggest thing that happened last week, which was my birthday. I have become a birthday person over the past 6 years or so, really like marking my own birthdays as not just like events because I think that they're important. Like in the grand scheme of things, birthdays are not the most important thing, but they're a great excuse to do something that you want to do. And that has been like the creative license that I've taken over the past couple of years with my birthdays. And this year was one of them too. But it was extra special because it was my 40th, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. I titled this live when I was scheduling it, Coming Out as an Invitation. And I think that I've been thinking about that. I mean, Pride Month is over. People can come out anytime. And coming out can look like a lot of different things. It doesn't just have to be about like gender or sexuality. But I've been thinking about coming out in terms of really the same question I've been mulling around for the past couple of years now, which is how would we meet each other if we were free? And coming out really is an act of self-definition, it's self-disclosure, and beyond just like kind of asserting oneself and saying, here I am, and putting oneself out there. I'm really thinking about it more as an invitation because we can know ourselves and we can be ourselves and we can live as ourselves in the world. But I think that the act of saying, this is who I am, and intentionally coming out in front of people with whom you're in relationship, whether that's, whatever kind of context it's in, it's really for the other people to be able to understand that this is who you are, and the coming out is an invitation for them to slightly adjust their perception of you, which hopefully would also, I would think, ideally, open up more space for a more authentic relationship. So in the case of like, coming out with gender, sexuality, other forms of coming out that are more traditionally understood, there's this way of saying like, there's a part of me that you haven't really fully known because I haven't been out with it. But if I let you know about this and like let you in, it's an invitation to say, I want this to be a way that you see me now. So I think the vulnerability around coming out, hi, thanks for joining. I think the vulnerability around coming out is always that like you don't know how people are going to respond, and it requires certain levels of confidence and safety. I'm not even talking about contextually, like external circumstances. I'm just talking about the interpersonal and intrapersonal constitution that happens with coming out. But the vulnerability is that, like, what if people don't get it? People don't see you. People don't accept you. And I keep falling back on this notion of coming out as an invitation because it's kind of like feedback. People think that it's, maybe we're getting confused about the directionality of it. I have a friend, Monica Rivera, who made the phrasing feedback is love such like an anchor for me and so many others. And that is a reframe. It's not to fall into this kind of, I think, unfortunate misconception of how people typically understand feedback of being something that you give to another person to shape them as if they're doing something wrong, and people take it as critique. I love the phrasing feedback is love because it's actually saying like, this is me extending myself to you, offering you something so that it can be felt as an investment or an opportunity, a door for us to have a richer, healthier relationship because I'm giving you information that would be conducive for that. And so it's an extension of oneself. To think that feedback is love means like someone is really loving you by offering you feedback so that there can be more possibility and opportunity for a more ideal version of however your interaction or relationship goes. I'm skipping over that a little bit. I could say more, but I always rattle off my definition of love constantly as the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's healing, transformation, and liberation. And in that sense, feedback falls squarely in that definition as extending oneself for a particular purpose. So coming out, I think, is similar. And when I've been thinking about the way that I wanted to come out for my 40th birthday, it really was inspired from this experience of being so deeply in this process of my own transformation for the past 5 years that I have worked through a lot of challenges and sort of vulnerabilities and hangups around being a person who grows and changes so much. I'm thinking about it honestly in the context of like a local community, because when you have people who know you, whether that's your family or friends or people who have like seen you over decades, for instance, there's this sort of long arc of knowing. And I think that there are ways that we can get stuck in certain kind of conceptions of each other, even conceptions of ourselves. So you can probably hear it already. There's a lot swirling around here around like ideas of a multiplicity of selves or the fluidity of our conception of ourselves and sort of the space that opens up with how we know each other. Some people only know a part of you or get a glimpse of you or a side of you based on whether or not you know each other through a professional space or you go way, way back from like your old hype days in college or something. Like there are different versions or facets, maybe is a better way of thinking about it, of ourselves that people know. And why this was so important for me for my 40th birthday is that I've been in a community where I know that there are like certain chapters of my life where people have interacted with me. I have people who have known me from like way, way, way back. And then there's a real chunk of my own community here of people who knew me in this like 7-year period of doing professional work in higher education. And that was an important phase of my life for sure. I learned a ton and experimented a lot and grew a lot in a way that was almost like kind of parallel to what I've been doing for the past 5 years. But I'm a very different person than I was back then, even in terms of the way that I understand the work that I'm doing and how I'm doing it. And then in the past 5 years, since I left that job, I have kind of been in this little like hermit mode. I spend a lot of time alone at home. I am deep in reflective spaces. I'm constantly working or writing or processing. I'm not isolated. I do spend a lot of time in conversation, connecting with people, building new relationships. But I've also expanded in the past 5 years my network of people into a broader community within my community. And I remember being like so astounded at different iterations of my life where I was like, oh, this little world that I've been in, this little bubble, I thought that was my world. But then as soon as I left it, it's like, there's a lot of other bubbles around here. And then it just kind of kept expanding. So, oh gosh, I'm already thinking like, oh my goodness, do we need to talk about world traveling? Ugh. I'm hearing a lot of the influence of Maria Lugones' work on my life, even just in me talking right now. So if you are taking notes or interested, I often refer to Maria Lugones as one of my like theoretical godmothers. Her work has influenced me so much, and in particular, the first essay was "Have We Got a Theory for You?" with Maria Lugones and Elizabeth Spellman. That was actually one of the first essays I was ever introduced to when I was learning feminist philosophy in undergrad. I did an independent study and my professor was like, why don't we start here with this essay? But the other essay that is like also extremely influential is Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception. Why am I surprised? I should not be surprised that this came up. I literally wrote Loving Perception on my notes like 2 days ago. But Maria Lugones' essay, Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception, is one articulation of her philosophy, which incorporates a lot of notions of a multiplicity of selves and the ways that we know and love and perceive each other. Wow. I don't know. I wasn't planning on going into like a deep analysis of that essay, but my brain's like firing because I could see all these little threads connecting to what I did want to talk about. Anywho, um, I could spend so much time unpacking the nature of our relationships and how we see each other and the growth or the transformation and the change and fluidity, even the ambiguity that allows, if we are sort of oriented towards a certain way of knowing one another that isn't, this is who you are, is like a stable, like one thing that has to be solid and consistent. Man, identity is tough. There's a lot going on here. Well, what I do know is that I'm going to be following this thread for sure. Maybe not unpacking all of it here today in this live, but I'm already anticipating my next For the Love of Strangers on July 17th to be about loving perceptions, which I'm getting ahead of myself and putting the cart way before the horse, but my brain doesn't work in a line. What I'm going to say is that I'm already planning For the Love of Strangers on July 17th to be a different kind of experience around loving perceptions that we have with each other and our parts of ourselves and how that works, which is going to be one little like dive into the epistemology of intimacy. And I already know that I'm blending my projects of For the Love of Strangers with the epistemology of intimacy that I'm developing. And that's just what happens when you reach a milestone like your 40th birthday and you make this big declaration. So let me rewind now a little bit and say where I am and what I wanted to talk about today and how I got here. So my 40th birthday was a big milestone because I did want to come out to all the people in my life. I invited a lot of folks and many people from past chapters of my life and current chapters right now. But regardless, it was really important for me to be able to say, this is how I want you to know me now. And that's the invitation. Some people still may not get it. And many people might still be like, but you're Cori from 2008. How I know you, it's still the same. And you can't control the way that people will see you or make meaning of like how you present yourself. But at least there is something, I think, powerful about exercising our agency in coming out or introducing ourselves in a certain kind of way, because it really like shows people where there is space for them to maybe adjust the way that they know and perceive you. And it doesn't just, maybe we should come out more, or kind of think about the practice of coming out in an expanded sense so that it doesn't just mean how we often think about it in terms of gender and sexuality, but coming out for the sake of, revolution or for the sake of greater intimacy. Going back to that question of how would we meet each other if we were really free? So I talked about this a little bit in my birthday philosophy, stand-up philosophy special. The stand-up philosophy special that I tried to create was called The Gay Gadfly. And I started with some introductions, a little bit of history of introductions. And the one that I wanted to talk about today is about philosophy in general and how I came into philosophy. I've blogged about this for decades. I talk about it sort of implicitly, I think, all the time, but I don't know that I've gone into great depth and detail on a live stream of like exactly what it means to me to be a philosopher. So in my coming out for my stand-up philosophy special, I introduced myself with old introductions, which was one from 2014, where I introduced myself to a group of people and said, hi, I'm Cori Wong, and I do philosophy. And that phrasing of doing philosophy caught someone's attention enough that they made a comment about it that it now became a memory of mine, like burned into my brain. It's like, why did I say do philosophy? Because this guy thought it was weird instead of saying I'm a philosopher or I studied philosophy. But I do philosophy, and I love that introduction because 2014 was accurate, and that has persisted. I still do philosophy, and it actually speaks very honestly to the way that I approach philosophy as the art of living. People often think of it as the love of wisdom, But I've always approached philosophy as something that has to be attached to our lives, that helps us be better people. And philosophers, I think, if we're responsible and not just academics or, research scholars, if we're really living as a philosopher, the art of living, then we should be trying to actually embody and align with the ideals, concepts, and values that we think hold some sort of water. So I think inherently to be a philosopher is a lot like to, presumably, we hope, be like, a religious figure where your beliefs inform your actions and shape your choices. And then that is how you live out your belief system, whether that's about a certain kind of cosmology or if it's the metaphysics of, the ontology of freedom, something like that, as an existentialist. So doing philosophy never sounded weird or unusual to me, but I like that was a historical introduction that I gave of myself in 2014, because now in 2026, the way that I'm introducing myself as boldly and confidently as possible is as a meta-philosophical performance artist. It's a lot of words. I've said it so many times on these lives, and beneath that, what it ultimately still is like a philosopher. It doesn't change so much. It's just adding on a little bit more of like embellishment. But again, like I just said, if a philosopher is really trying to live into their values or practicing the theories and the concepts and the values and the ideals of a certain way of making meaning and understanding the world, then the doing should follow suit. And so the metaphilosophical performance art is doing the philosophy. I had a friend ask me just the other night, she was like, what does meta do for you in all of this? Like, why don't you just call yourself a philosophical performance artist? And it's funny how difficult it is for people to get meta. Like this is the hang up, like the barrier to, I think, like the real clicking, which is ironic because I always say that meta part is important because once you get it, it's like, the click happens and it feels like this aha moment. But anyway, I guess that's just the curse of being meta all the time. But rather than being like a philosophical performance artist, I don't know. If I think about that, it sounds to me like one could perform a philosophy, just like we could say certain films or whatever have very philosophical underpinnings. And, or like lyrics are very philosophical where they're like asking big questions to songs. So I think that there's a way that we could do performance and performance art with philosophical themes. And then we could say I'm a philosophical performance artist. And that's not exactly what I'm doing, because the meta part has to be overlaid on top of that to emphasize and really point out the fact that I'm trying to also do the thing itself that we're talking about. So if my epistemology of intimacy is the philosophy, then the meta part would be becoming more intimate in the process of doing the philosophy. So I'm not just musing about intimacy and connection. I'm trying to actually facilitate the experiential embodiment of that so that it also is happening. And another thing that I told my friend when she was like, why meta? Like, what is the significance? Maybe you could explain to people why it's important or what it's doing for you and like the way that it works and why it's like so important to emphasize. And one of the things that I always emphasize about the meta stuff that I really appreciate is that there's a certain layer of our experience that goes from the happening, which is kind of like material bodied, fleshy stuff that we can be like, you can point to it because it's happening. And then the heady, theoretical, abstract, intellectual stuff that people think is where most philosophy lives. I think the meta part is that like liminal space right between those two dimensions where they meet. And also because that's right where they meet with our consciousness and our like embodied participation in it, there's this really beautiful layer of truth that can happen, which I think is so significant because we are in a place where truth is questionable. People will fight and argue about truth. And one of the questions that I get the most from people when they're just like following along or listening or like reading whatever I'm writing, I talk about truth quite a bit. And so the most common question is, whose truth, or what do you mean by truth, or what is truth? Wow, deep philosophical question, the one for like millennia that people have been asking. And there are entire fields and like so many books and so many traditions and schools of thought that talk about truth itself. And if you want to go that path, then yeah, become a philosopher in the most traditional sense. Like, you become now philosophically inclined. But the truth that I'm talking about in terms of meta and why I love it so much is that there's this moment of being like, well, if very much nothing else, we can at least say this is happening right now, even if it's I'm confused about what is real. If we are engaging on that level and going like meta cognition is a way of thinking about it, but to go meta on it, to like, I keep doing this. I guess this is the motion of meta. If you remove yourself one step to now reflect on the thing as it's happening, then it is a little bit like Descartes' meditations, where he was like, well, I don't know if I'm a being, I don't know if I'm a brain in a vat. I'm mixing philosophies here. But when Descartes landed on I think, therefore I am, his confidence was like, I can't tell you much about anything else other than the fact that I am literally thinking right now. And so that says to me that I'm existing. We're really skirting a lot of details here. But that's what I mean about this like certain thin layer of confidence around at least something true is happening. I shared at the stand-up philosophy special that like a lot of people are actually quite familiar with meta happenings, even if we don't name it as that. And the example I gave is maybe not the fun stuff of meta philosophical performance art, but instead being meta enough to realize like something's happening and you're conscious of it. And it can be really frustrating if other people are not conscious of it. So the example I gave is of, when you're like in a conversation with someone, and it could be someone was like, I do this all the time when I'm fighting with my partner, where I will say like, oh, we're trying to practice really good communication right now, so I'm using I statements, and you are getting defensive when I'm trying to express myself, or you're interrupting me, which now is feeling like it's not a helpful or healthy dynamic. And then that person will get defensive and interrupt you and say, I'm not interrupting you. And then you'd be like, well, you're literally doing it right now. And the person who lacks that awareness of it happening can not make the connection to like the meta cognitive awareness of this thing as it plays out. And that's what can be really frustrating. But the moment that clicks and someone goes, oh, I am actually doing it right now, suddenly you're not being defensive and saying, I'm not an interrupter. You would go, oh, wait a minute. I literally did just interrupt someone, so maybe that makes me kind of an interrupter. And that's the bing, like light bulb. That's what we want. We want that tiny little pop of awareness, because it becomes a kind of, it's not self-consciousness in the way of like, insecurity, but it's self-consciousness in the way of being aware of oneself. And that is, oh my God, probably one of the worst things that can happen and leads us to the social, political, environmental realities that we're facing that are really hard, when people cannot be self-conscious of themselves. They lack awareness of what they are literally doing right now and how they are literally in something right now. So, the way that I've actually ended up describing truth, that little thin layer of truth that's this like liminal space in the meta engagement of things, I describe truth as like, maybe truth is a conscious and attuned relationship to what is happening. It's not going to capture everything. It's like my version of Descartes' meditations. But if truth is a conscious and attuned relationship to what is happening, then maybe we could still fight about like the interpretation of what is happening. But I don't know, in that case, like, cop out. Go one more level up. Like, now we're arguing about what is actually happening. It might be a cheap escape route, but I think my emphasis on it is more than anything not really to land on something solid about truth, but more to exercise the brain muscles to get people to think about how to engage a greater level of conscious awareness to the present moment so that we can register when something is meta. That's really my project here. I don't think that what I'm saying is like truth in a comprehensive, universal kind of sense. So don't go quoting me on truth when you're in deep metaphysical arguments with people. Okay, I'm nowhere near my notes right now. I wrote some things, but I'm just riffing at this point. So, okay, how do we get back to something? If you have questions, if you're in the chat, let me know. I'd be happy to respond. If you have thoughts, help me out. Anyway, maybe we can tie this back to like the truth of ourselves and coming out, because there is a certain kind of disclosure when we come out, when we introduce ourselves, that ideally we assume we're saying something true and that is how we want people to know us and how we know ourselves. I did make a little note here a little bit on, I have for a while now explicitly engaged this question of how would we meet each other if we were free? And then the follow-up question would be, what would that allow us to do, or how would that change our connections if, when we met, we were free? You could also use the language of like, from a place of liberation, how would we meet each other? And that is a sort of provocative thought experiment. I know from the past couple of years of like really deep engagement that a lot of people struggle even with understanding, like, from a place of liberation, what does that look and feel like? What do you mean? Let's just assume we're all very comfortable and familiar with understanding what it means to move from a place of liberation. But if we start there, and if we met from a place of liberation, how would that change our connections? I really think these are the kinds of questions we need to be meditating on, because they give us a little bit of an outline of different possibilities for how we could move with each other and how we could connect with each other, to make it real, to make it more common, rather than this like anomalous thought experiment. We could actually like intentionally now go, oh, well, if I met somebody and I introduced myself from this place of my own sense of freedom and liberation, I might introduce myself to them as a metaphilosophical performance artist. And then maybe that would change the nature of our relationship and what would happen. Of course, it's not to be one-sided, but you get what I'm going for. My note was that to be free in this, I referenced a conversation I had with a friend several years ago when we were talking about how we were both trying to do our respective work. And I told him, I was like, there's just something that I know what I want to do, and I don't know how to like get myself over these hangups. This was in the fall of 2024. And I told him, like, forever it's been microphone, stage, pages, philosophy, tell the stories that are true about my life, and like do it in a certain kind of way that feels very true and honest and authentic to me, which is going to be fun and funny and like not so heavy academic, but like, you know, engaged to a certain degree. And he said, well, I remember he asked me, like, who are my role models for this? And I said, I want to be able to create and do performance art like Miranda July does. And I want to write like Bell Hooks, because her writing is so accessible. And when we were talking about Miranda July, he goes, well, what is it about Miranda July exactly that like makes her a role model for you? And I have been a fan of Miranda July's work for decades, literally. I remember I was like 18 when I bought Me, You, and Everyone We Know. And I said, Miranda July is just like such a weirdo creative freak. She's so experimental and like does a lot of collaborative, like co-creative kind of community sourced projects. And it's just constant, but the themes of queerness and intimacy, and like feminism, counter cultural, breaking the taboos, like all this stuff is just so sort of woven into everything that I think that she does. And when I said that she's like a weirdo creative freak, my friend was like, Miranda July, the thing is no fear. And he was quoting Nina Simone, of saying that like when Nina Simone's quote says, I can tell you what freedom means to me, it means no fear. And I think that that's interesting from a place of like framing. follow me. When I ask people what liberation looks and feels like, the easiest answer is not oppressed. You know what I mean? It's like negating the other thing. So if we were to say freedom in the way we're talking about, like if we were met each other and we were free, as no fear, then we're negating the other thing. But what is it actually instead of what it's not? I do find that no fear is a helpful starting place, but this is why I've been leaning more and more into the way that I've read Audre Lorde with the uses of the erotic, of more fully and creatively expressing our energy. I actually found a quote the other day. I think I'm misquoting her. It's not expressing our energies, it's using our energies, which makes sense because it's the use of the erotic. But more fully and creatively using our energies, that to me is my latest understanding of like freedom in a positively defined way, not just negating what it's not. And I like that because it gives us like action. There's like something tangible. You can imagine what that looks like. But there's this other piece of when I raise this question of how would we meet each other if we were free? And even if we were to say like no fear, I feel like a lot of people stumble when they first reflect on that question of how would we meet each other if we were free or from a place of liberation. One, because we're not very well practiced in moving from a place of liberation and knowing what that means. But right there underneath the surface, so many people are like, ooh, what do you mean we don't introduce ourselves with like our job title or like where we're from or something else that, you know, is like pretty scripted and socially acceptable. In this like, you're not going to offend anybody, you're not going to reveal too much, it feels safe, all that kind of thing. But the other piece that I know that I think, if we're really honest, is like kind of at the core of any discomfort or uneasiness that people might feel, is that a lot of people might struggle to know themselves. And so to say, can you introduce yourself if you were free, as if you were free, or even this whole way that I started with like coming out. To come out means that there's this something of you that you are aware of, that you want other people to be aware of. And now I'm thinking of Socrates. Was it Socrates? About like know thyself? That this is like really where it starts, is like to know who you are, to know thyself so that you have something to say. And actually, is it also like right there after knowing thyself that you realize you don't know anything, and then you're the wisest person, like Socrates. Anyway, I see people's faces when I ask that question of like, from a place of liberation, if you weren't just rattling off all of our social conventions that we've been conditioned to introduce ourselves with, but if you're really to get like to the heart and soul of the matter, like who you really are, without any fear, being fully authentic, being in your power, expressing and using your energies as fully as possible, who would you be? Most people struggle to have an answer, and it pokes at something really uncomfortable. Mostly, I think it's that unknown of not knowing oneself. So anyway, wow, I did not mean to go on that. What I really wanted to get to was that the reason why I did my coming out gay gadfly stand-up philosophy special is because I have transformed so much over the past 5 years, and I wanted people to know me as this person, the metaphilosophical performance artist. And I have to say that it requires a little bit of no fear to rattle off that 4-word mouthful of a description, because most people don't understand it. And that is like exactly what so many of us are afraid of when we introduce ourselves, like we won't be understood or we will be misunderstood. So I don't know what kind of double down energy I've got on this, where I'm just so fucking stubborn to keep using these phrases, even when one of my good friends continues to question my word choices and if they're all necessary. But I feel like there's something important to me about saying metaphilosophical performance artist. And it's how I want people to understand. And if they don't get it, that's okay for now. Maybe they never will. But it's way more satisfying if someone can be like, oh, yeah, yep, it is the metaphilosophical performance artist. That is right. Because that's how I want people to see me. I don't want to have to change my language to say, well, I'm kind of like being a philosopher with the people and doing creative stuff. I want people to be able to understand me at the level of my description of metaphilosophical performance art. And it's not for everybody. But when people get there, that is where now I know we can have a different kind of connection, because it's like a different degree or maybe clarity of understanding that to me reflects what I started with, of the invitation of a different way of relating to one another. And I don't think this is all just like semantics and word, obsession. I really think that what is happening here is like having language to articulate what is so meaningful to us, which is a way of expressing and using, our tools, what we have available at our disposal to connect. And so much of what we lack is clear language to be able to like paint the understanding that allows us to see each other more lovingly, to echo back to Maria Lugones, loving perception. Okay, we're 37 minutes in, and I wanted to talk about being a philosopher. Okay. Metaphilosophical performance art, yes. Philosopher, below that, definitely. More specifically, queer feminist philosopher. And that is important. Let me tell you why. I'm going to talk for the rest of this time about how I have related to myself as being a philosopher and philosophy as a discipline, because this is something that like I don't actually talk so much about philosophy in general, but for the past 2 decades it's kind of been like the bloodstream of my projects. I don't like that. The lifeblood of my, I don't like that either. Whatever. It's important. Okay, so when I was in graduate school, I was very much a feminist philosopher. And people would be like, why feminist philosophy? Like, what's the difference between that and philosophy? And back then, because I was still sassy, I would say, feminist philosophy is basically philosophy done better. And I will stand by that forever, still. Because it's not, there's like this notion that philosophy is just a discipline, and then feminist philosophy is like the subset of philosophy that focuses on like gender or whatever. No. Do not get that confused. Feminist philosophy has the same sort of scope of philosophy as a large discipline where you've got ethics, you have political philosophy, you have epistemology, you have metaphysics, you have all the branches of philosophy, including the others, philosophy of language, philosophy of science. There's so many different elements of the discipline of philosophy that feminist philosophy is not just like one within the many. It is an entire lens for all of them. So you can have feminist ethics, feminist epistemology, yada, yada, yada. You get what I'm saying. And the reason why I think that feminist philosophy is philosophy done better is specifically because of the feminist angle. Now, feminism is a contentious word when you get into the history of the women's movement or the feminist movement and the way that has been racialized to privilege white women and leave out like solidarity for trans feminists and those kinds of things, and women of color in particular. But I'm using feminist in a very like less broad way, maybe focused way, which is a political lens of self-consciousness to critique philosophy. So in a way, feminist philosophy is philosophy done better because it's reflecting on the assumptions of philosophy itself through a political lens of gender, namely, but not only, to critique the bias of philosophy itself as a discipline. So feminist epistemology is very different from like traditional Western philosophy's epistemology, where you have this sort of obsession of, I'm using really trite examples, objectivity with a capital O, and you have to have this sort of impartiality and God's eye view of being very, very much removed from the thing so that your reason is what is somehow deducting its way to the logic of the truth. That is, one, boring and makes me want to barf just to even think about having to do philosophy that way. But feminist philosophy and feminist epistemology, for instance, is like, well, actually, we have feelings. It's not just all reason in our head, but sometimes the relationships and the proximity that we have to something, the closeness that we have to something is what allows us to know it better, even. So it's appropriate to be involved, to be close, to have some level of relationship to the thing that we are investigating, and then you add on layers of like that level of investment and relationship in something actually isn't necessarily a bias that could distort us, but it's a bias of care that like we want it to do well. We want to look out for our best interests or whatever. So like there's this whole spin that basically inverts all of the worst parts of traditional patriarchal white Western philosophy. Feminist philosophy isn't the only one that does that. There are other disciplines or like angles of taking perspectives on philosophy, but the core part is it is a self-consciousness of a critique on the discipline itself. So it is sort of meta-philosophical. Okay, I'm going to read this comment. It's a lot of brothers out there flaking and perpetuating, but scared to kick reality. You've been doing all this dope producing, but you ain't had a chance to show them what time it is. So what you want me to do? Express yourself? Are these song lyrics? Is this Madonna? What are we listening to? Let me keep going on the meta-philosophy stuff. The meta-philosophical questions or the meta-philosophical approach of feminist philosophy, which is why it's done better than traditional. Oh, NWA, that makes more sense than Madonna. Oh my gosh, don't get me distracted. Okay, I have to tell you about a date with the universe I had last night where I was watching old hip-hop music videos. Remind me if I forget, because 90% chance I'll forget. Let me get back to meta-philosophical questions and the practice of meta-philosophy. So feminist philosophy is being self-critical of the discipline of philosophy itself by engaging in all the same sort of branches of philosophy. So I come from a place of feminist epistemology and feminist ethics. And then probably some other stuff too. Oh, feminist philosophy of science was another big gateway for me. But before even getting into feminist theory, the truth of how I got into philosophy is, I'm going to go 2 steps, one right in the middle, is from David Dean, who's the Catholic theologian. I refer to him a lot. And he was the one who introduced me to queer theory and feminist theory, and in particular 4 major questions that sort of encapsulate everything that I do. What is philosophy, or what does philosophy do? I got it wrong already. Who is the philosopher? What does the philosopher do? What is philosophy? And what does philosophy do? So even these questions of doing philosophy are like built into the foundations of how I became a philosopher. But I remember having conversations with David Dean. We were like always have office hours and continue our conversations outside of class. And he would say, philosophy as a discipline needs to become self-conscious of itself. Like it needs to become critical. Otherwise, the discipline is just going to like basically bury itself because it becomes obsolete. It becomes so obtuse, so isolated and like sequestered away from anything real that it does become like the worst sort of caricature and stereotype of philosophy of being this sort of, intellectual masturbation. I don't love that phrasing, but that's what people say. So this, futile, just totally so abstract that it becomes less relevant. I don't believe that is the nature of philosophy. Again, I come from a tradition that thinks this is the art of living. It is very concrete. It is very integral to our ways of life. And beneath everything, even math or even art or even, whatever you want to talk about. I'm not trying to be a philosophy supremacist here, but there is a way of thinking like that there's a philosophy beneath everything else that we ever do, which is kind of why getting a PhD is a doctorate of philosophy in any field that offers a PhD. You're not just a doctorate of philosophy. When you get a PhD, you are getting the degree in the philosophy of the discipline that you are studying. So the underlying philosophy of things exists, and that's why it's important for us to be able to do philosophy. But I live with that early message from David Dean of saying philosophy as a discipline, if it wants to survive, needs to become critical of itself and really ask these questions. Who is the philosopher? What do they do? What is philosophy? And what does philosophy do? Because otherwise we are gatekeeping and limiting the suitability of what becomes acceptable according to reified standards of philosophy that keeps a lot of important people out, that keeps a lot of really necessary questions from being asked. And that is the exclusionary channel that becomes the predominant white man philosophy doing things that most other people find not helpful in the real world. So, um, now I want to talk a little bit about, like, that's really the root of my philosophy. Understanding that I'm doing meta philosophical questions, which has now, in the long arc of 20 years, turned into meta philosophical performance art. But that arc is not so disparate or, like, surprising, I guess, if you know what happened in the meantime. And so this is where I wanted to say, because, like, I'm going to tell a little bit of a history of my personal experience in philosophy. And I'm doing this because it's setting up for kind of where I see myself now. The 40th birthday, again, was a mile marker. I wanted to come out in a certain kind of way because I see that as, like, the threshold of something that I have now moved through after 5 really intense years, 2.5 years of a lot of therapy, to be able to engage in my own philosophy differently. Like, I am wanting to do it. I am ready to go forth. And that's why I wanted people to know me, because it's like, I could do it on my own, but I can't do anything on my own. Nobody can. And we need support in our relationships and our networks and our communities. So I was trying to invite people to join me in this movement forward by understanding how I'm understanding myself by coming out for my 40th birthday. But again, to me, it makes sense. To people who know my history, it probably makes sense. But a lot of people don't know the history. So I wanted to share a little bit more about some of these little, like, touchstones in my path of philosophy. So first and foremost, I do think it's probably relevant that, like, I didn't get into philosophy because I was like, I'm going to be a philosopher. I got into philosophy on accident because I wanted to drop out of college because I was so frustrated with what I was not learning in school. And then because I had studied Buddhism specifically, but a lot of Eastern philosophies with one professor, she was the one who was like, don't you dare drop out of college. That's so stupid. At least get a degree. You're on track right now, accidentally, to get a philosophy degree. So just major in philosophy. That way you can graduate in 4 years still and not, like, burn your time and your money and all of that. So I did major in philosophy, and it was only after that that then I met David Dean, who introduced me to the meta-philosophical questions that now have shaped my life. But I think that's important because I wasn't looking to be a philosopher. Honestly, I don't know what kind of 16, 17, 18-year-old wants to be a philosopher. More power to them if they have that clarity in knowing themselves like that. But that was not me. And so I kind of always felt like I didn't really belong in philosophy because it wasn't something that spoke so deeply to me. I kind of felt like I was just picking at the fringes of it. So anyway, I made it through my undergrad. And then I did this institute at Penn State called Philosophy in an Inclusive Key Summer Institute in 2007. And I have written about this too, and we'll talk effusively all the time about it because it was truly life-changing. In this, like, I think it was 10 days of a summer institute geared toward getting underrepresented people in philosophy on the path of pursuing graduate school as a long game to diversify the field. And it has worked. Thanks to Pixie. Great things have happened in the discipline. But I was in the second cohort of that institute ever even happening. And that was where I learned that, philosophy actually can be really relevant to our lives. And the emphasis was that your identity and your experience is really important for how you can do philosophy in meaningful ways. So instead of saying fit into the white man, boring, bland norms of the way that the discipline has been historically gate-kept and exclusionary, there's room for you to do philosophy in the way that makes your identity and your experience matter to the what of philosophy. Hugely important experience. So transformative. I met people through that institute that eventually were on my committee and also became my advisor. So Shannon Sullivan was at Penn State, and she became my advisor when I actually went to Penn State for grad school then. But in graduate school, I also didn't fit into philosophy very well because I still didn't really get it. I have never been a real academic, like, rigorous scholar. And more importantly, I think the part that really captures how this worked for me, or didn't work for me more accurately, was that I wrote this paper about Nietzsche, and I have talked about this one before too. The paper was basically arguing that Nietzsche was my friend and he loved me back, and this was what I learned by reading his philosophical works. I also thought it was really relevant that as I was reading things like the gay science, I was having really strong emotional reactions to it. Like, really excited, really just in awe, so elated, and like sometimes really challenged and provoked. Like, I was feeling my body as I was reading Nietzsche's philosophy. And that to me felt really important because I was like, that's not how I feel when I read a lot of philosophy. Let's be real. But it was exciting to me and it was affecting me in this way. And I'm like, is Nietzsche doing this on purpose? So that sort of became this like seed nugget of my interest in Nietzsche and in philosophy. So I wrote this paper, Nietzsche's my friend and he loves me back. That wasn't the title, but it was the gist of it. And the idea was to say that, like, by reading his work, what Nietzsche's really looking for are his friends and his companions. And he says that much in his philosophy. And he also says, I'm speaking to people who cannot hear me. They don't have the ears to hear me yet. So maybe my fellow higher men, or free spirits, as he would call them, are yet to come. And that's why I was like, yeah, who cares if it's a century and a half later? Maybe Nietzsche was talking to me. And here I am, Nietzsche. Thank you. I see you. That paper did not get great remarks when I was passing my PhD candidacy. I remember specifically one faculty member being like, where's the argument in this? Because I didn't write it like a traditional philosophical argumentative essay as a seminar paper. I was saying, like, Nietzsche makes me feel things. And I think he meant to. And they said, that's not philosophy. Oh, funny. If only they had the metaphilosophical questions right in front of their face, too, all the time, then maybe they wouldn't have asked that. But anyway, the long story short is that the faculty did not like that paper. And so they really didn't like when I doubled down on trying to make that my dissertation. And my dissertation idea, which I have again spoken about, was wanting to argue that there's philosophical significance to the style and manner in which someone like Nietzsche writes and does their philosophy. The gay science, of course, is one of levity, it's one of breaking traditional values, and I would think that there could be some metaphilosophical questions about, questioning what is philosophy and what does the philosopher do, even how does the philosopher do it, namely, maybe not in standard philosophical prose, but right there, you're going to push yourself to the edges and have people be like, no, this isn't philosophy, because we can point to the things that we accept as our standards to decide that that's not philosophy. And it becomes this sort of cycle. But I don't know. I wanted to write that, and now I was catching myself. I've told this story before of saying, I think that there's philosophical significance to the style and manner of how one does their philosophy. In other words, in order to really understand the philosophical ideas that Nietzsche is conveying, one has to be able to make meaning of that through the style of his writing, the poetics, the metaphor, the literary quality, all of the, like, apparently there are jokes and puns that I don't know because I don't speak German or read German, which is a flaw and a problem for my intimacy with Nietzsche. But basically, I don't know that you could really fully understand his philosophy if you didn't understand him or you didn't understand his style. Like, it's not like a Cliff Notes version here. You can't get the gist of it just by reading bullet points or a summary and a synopsis. I think that there is something affectively significant about being able to feel something. It's kind of like if someone tells you the meaning of a poem versus you actually feeling and reading through the poem 100 times. That the connection you have to the what of it is very, very markedly different. And like I said, I think that's philosophically significant. But if I'm honest, my phrasing for decades has always been philosophically and politically significant. Whenever I ask these kind of questions, I go, oh, isn't that philosophically and politically significant? So I would wonder if maybe the style and manner of doing philosophy is not just philosophically significant for conveying the ideas, but politically significant too. What do I mean by that? I think that the political significance is coming down to, one, you could say something as simple as like who gets excluded? How are the gatekeepers keeping people out or saying that's not legitimate philosophy? But we could also go a different direction on that and say the political significance of speaking in a certain kind of way that maybe the gatekeepers wouldn't understand is kind of like code. You know, code switching. There is a certain resistance strategy to not speaking to the oppressor, to not assimilating one's language to the standards that determine whether or how someone is legitimate or acceptable. And so I do think that there's like a possibility that, among many other interpretations of political significance, doing philosophy in a certain kind of way that exists outside of the institutions and standards and norms of those that say this is, we're talking about philosophy, so philosophy, being able to express and connect and do philosophy outside of those institutions or mechanisms, I think could be very philosophically and politically significant. In my mind, I hope this is obvious, like I'm thinking this goes beyond philosophy. Like there are many other ways to be thinking about how to do politically significant work in a coded kind of way that is not readily interpretable or legible to the gatekeepers who would otherwise try to shut it down, right? We could also say it could be politically significant to do it with a kind of levity and gaiety and playfulness that actually is healthy for us. Now that was what eventually became my actual dissertation. Let me loop back to that storyline so I can tell you what happened. Yes, I was able to become a PhD candidate in my graduate program. But when I tried to defend my dissertation proposal, the first one, there was one comment in particular that really stood out to me. And more specifically, there was one faculty member, and I don't know why I'm protecting his identity and all this stuff, because that dude hated me, and he spoke openly about how much he didn't think I belonged in the department, to my face and to others. We had plenty of confrontations, so I wish I could call him out. Whatever is happening right now, where I am like protecting him, maybe I'm protecting myself by not saying his name, but regardless, that guy did not like me. Even though he said I might have actually discovered something unique and original about John Locke and his notion of equality. I'm sure he wrote a paper about it if that was true, and I didn't get credit for it. Anywho, this particular faculty member, when I was defending my dissertation prospectus, now having written 4 to 6 chapter drafts, he basically said, so you're going to say that the way of doing philosophy, as it has been done in academia for decades, nay, centuries, is boring and irrelevant, and therefore leading the philosophy discipline to its own sort of demise of being not valuable any longer. And I didn't use any of those words, I'm pretty sure, but I just basically looked him in the eye and said, yep, that's what I'm saying. And that basically was my argument. Because I was doing the meta-philosophical questions of who is the philosopher, what does the philosopher do, what is philosophy, what should philosophy do, and I would add, how does it do it? How do they, the philosophers, do it? And I said, yeah, actually, I'm not going to be so bold as to say everything is irrelevant, but I have always been motivated by this passion to do philosophy publicly in accessible and engaging ways because I actually believe in philosophy, because I actually have had the life experience where philosophy truly changed my life. So my whole principle was always, if it's this powerful, if philosophy is this valuable, if it's this transformative, if philosophy is this significant, then why wouldn't we do it in a way that engages a wider audience, that makes it widely available for people to have a similar transformative experience and that changes their lives? Why wouldn't we want more people to be so affected by and attracted to this notion of doing philosophy in a certain kind of way that we would want more philosophers? And in sheer numbers of maintaining the livelihood of a discipline in academia, that counts on enrollment. That is butts and chairs and head counts to keep people in the discipline. That's why Pixie, the institute, was created, was to diversify, bring people in, increase the numbers of people doing graduate work to contribute to the discipline of philosophy. We need people doing it. So why not make it interesting, exciting, irresistible, affecting, and empowering? Why not make philosophy something that is so passionate that people would be like, damn, I want to be a philosopher, and let it change our lives? So he didn't like that when he paraphrased my take by saying, so you're just going to tell all the philosophers who've been doing this that professional philosophy is very boring and irrelevant and puts people to sleep. And I was like, I mean, yeah, actually. Kind of, yes. You can imagine how that went. It did not go well. That guy who already hated me even more. Fortunately, we got him off of my committee. But that's why I had to pivot. I couldn't write my dissertation about Nietzsche because literally a dissertation that I could write to demonstrate my argument of the philosophical significance of style and manner in conveying philosophical ideas, that would require me to write in a more creative, maybe more free way, maybe more poetic or mixed media. I don't know, some other kind of way that would never be accepted by traditional standards of what a dissertation is supposed to do. So basically, the answer was no, you can't write this dissertation. Logistically, it's not possible. Theoretically, it also fell apart because in order to prove my argument, to be meta, I would have to write it in a certain kind of way to convey the ideas. Otherwise, I'm just talking about it and pointing to it, but not literally doing it. And what kind of argument is that? So anyway, I hope right there you caught, like, there's a couple loops going on. Like, where's the argument? How are you writing this? What counts as philosophy? What is legitimate? Are we pointing at? Are we doing at it, meta or not? All of those things kind of had this culminating co-presence in the conflicts that were me navigating graduate school and trying to write my dissertation. So now, I'm thinking back on the past 6 months alone and what has happened and what I have shared on these lives. There was that full moon in February of 2026 when I found the chapters of my first dissertation, and I didn't even realize it. I still haven't read all of them. It's been busy. But that moment of, like, uncovering that these were the drafts of that dissertation is so exciting. And I'm glad that it happened in the past 6 months. It feels very much aligned with, like, just the nature of the past 6 months. But that was kind of the little, like, light bulb moment to be like, maybe I should rethink these arguments that I had about Nietzsche, about his writing, about his philosophy, about doing philosophy from way back when. But if you've been tracking the past several months, they've kind of, like, morphed on their own to even so recently. I was like, oh, maybe I need to be Nietzsche. Maybe I need to be my own Nietzsche and write my own work in this kind of way instead of saying this is what Nietzsche did. A lot of people disagree with me. Again, they're like Nietzsche scholars and say, that's not what Nietzsche was up to. You're reading him wrong. And I've never read him in Russian. So maybe I am Russian? German. I've never read him in German. So maybe I am reading him wrong. I'm willing to accept that. So on the likelihood that maybe I am reading Nietzsche wrong and that's not actually what he was doing, then all that leaves me with is that that's what I've been wanting to do. Or maybe that's what my philosophy contribution actually is, to do philosophy in a different kind of way. So hence, as a meta-philosophical performance artist, I have been doing philosophy for over 2 decades, publicly, online, via my own blogs, and especially in the past couple of years, through really intentional, experimental, creative engagement with people in community. I'm so excited to keep doing that, and I moved through the threshold, that, like, milestone of my 40th birthday, to come out as a metaphilosophical performance artist, so that now I can actually be going forth with the epistemology of intimacy. And I know I've talked about that for literally feels like years too, but I'm getting it now. There's nothing else. The months that I've been saying, time and a process, and you gotta go through it. Everything takes time. I know everything takes time, and so I'm not rushing the process, but I can literally see how the process has been unfolding. And what happened last week with my stand-up philosophy special was a really important moment in that process. Now I will say, I don't have to say this, but I'm just gonna be honest. It didn't turn out exactly how I wanted it to either. It was great. I'm proud of it, and I had a really good time, and I'm so grateful for everybody that was there to be like part of the experience, not just to witness it, but to be part of the whole experience of coming out in this way. But what I wanted to do was something much more polished and like written down. It was 6 months ago that I had the idea to do a stand-up philosophy special. I just didn't fully nail that down in time because I was writing, and the writing turned out to be really, really hard. So I wrote for like 3.5 weeks and was like, wow, I'm not going to memorize this. I have to pivot. I have to do it in a way that I can do it. So I did it more in the way that I'm comfortable with, thanks to my year plus of experience in experimenting with For the Love of Strangers. And it became this kind of melding of the Gadfly and For the Love of Strangers, calling it the gay Gadfly, which was really focusing on the content of me being gay, as in, well, also Nietzsche's gay science and the levity and the style of being a gadfly a la Socrates, but the gay gadfly of a kind of way of being in one's philosophical life. I did all of that. I feel good about it. What it has left me with are some questions and some loose ends on my projects. I do intend, hopefully one day, to write an hour-long stand-up philosophy special. I guess maybe my birthday wasn't the time to do it. It was maybe premature, because I feel like if I'm going to do a stand-up philosophy special where I literally write it out for an hour and memorize it and like perform it, then what I want that to be is something that would be my philosophy. I've only uttered those words a couple of times in the past year because it's taken me this long to really get to a place of accepting that, like, do I have a philosophy? Like something so original to contribute that I could be like, yeah, that is actually my philosophy. And I think that I do. I just haven't ever presented it so explicitly in that way. So even though I didn't do it for my birthday, that is still very close on a near back burner of writing an hour-long stand-up philosophy special that one maybe would understand as my presentation of a philosophy, my own. Kind of like a dissertation done right, where the style and manner of how I want to share actually to convey the philosophical meaning of the ideas and concepts that are at hand is really part and parcel to how it's done. So it's cool that I was able to do the gay gadfly even though it wasn't exactly that. It just made me want to continue doing it. Like, it confirmed that is a goal and a project worth pursuing. The other thing that I am going to now continue working on is the epistemology of intimacy, and I keep saying that. But like, I really wanted to get through June so I could launch into July with a lot of work. July is a very busy month for me. I have a lot of things that I just have to do that are not going to be like showable. So, oh well. But one of the things that I'm going to do is wrap up the pages for Romancing the Revolution and compile that into a complete volume. It'll probably end up being close to 150 pages, and I want that to become its own standalone downloadable resource. It's not exactly an ebook because you can't get it on your Kindle or whatever, but it is a downloadable PDF when it exists. And that's going to be the culmination of just the pages that have been collected from the past few months of Romancing the Revolution. I am thrilled about that and can't wait to get that like in its own existence. But the epistemology of intimacy, I want to continue working on writing and sharing, and I think that will come through in various formats, including For the Love of Strangers moving forward, maybe even the Gadfly moving forward, maybe even other things. I don't know, but I feel like things are changing now, and I'm happy and excited for it. There was one last thing, that I was going to say. Speaking of introductions, just to add a little extra on all of this, the way that I'm also experimenting with this process includes introductions with this knowing of like, if you are who you are, if you are who you say you are, if you are who you know you are, or you act and lean into who you know yourself to be, if you have become who you are, the phrasing that I often quote Nietzsche on, what would be different? And one example of how I'm experimenting with that right now is in therapy, because my therapist, thank goodness for her, for 2.5 years, I reached out to her really explicitly wanting to work on the interconnected nature of vulnerability, authenticity, doing my philosophical work, being in community, all these things. 2.5 years of really concerted effort and diligent focus on these themes. And I think it's really paid off. But then she had a baby a couple weeks early even. And I thought, maybe I can do this without a therapist. I think I can. I can manage. But then I had this other thought of, well, what would happen if I started a different kind of professional therapeutic relationship with someone who I don't know, but after having done this 2.5 years of work with my other therapist? And I just was really curious, like, I wonder what those conversations would look like. Would be a different person. I'm practically a different person. So I have also started, as of yesterday, a new therapeutic relationship with a different counselor for just the next few months. We're going to see how it goes. But I'm thinking about this because my openness to like explore therapy with a different counselor while I'm this version of myself after having done so much important work in the past 2.5 years. It's like, I wonder how that would change the nature of our relationship, because I feel more free. I feel more grounded. I feel like I've done such important healing that now I would go to a therapist in a very different way than I did 2.5 years ago. So what would that look like? And that is like a microcosm, just a tiny little example of basically the curiosity that I have right now after walking through this 40-year-old threshold of a coming out portal, where I feel myself being so much more open to like, yeah, what does happen? If I could introduce myself as this person who I know myself to be now, what else could change? So that includes like dating. It includes relationships of all sorts with friends and community. It includes professional possibilities and opportunities, whether that's through my own consulting or something else. And I feel like once I've claimed myself because I know myself and have been able to accept like, this is how I want to move forward, suddenly it just felt like a new hallway of doors. If you remember back in January, oh, what a painful time that was for me. I described my experience of walking down a narrow hallway where all of these doors were shutting. And I was like, this fucking sucks. But now it's interesting because 6 months later, I feel like I've just gone through this 40-year-old portal and I see new doors opening, but only because I am ready to walk through them as this version of myself. So I started this by saying coming out is an invitation for others to adjust their ways of knowing and relating to us, that it really is a sort of extension and invitation for other people. But I guess, of course, inherently in there's also, the invitation to know ourselves differently too. And maybe that sounds trite, or maybe that sounds incredibly difficult, but maybe it's something that we can all just sit with too, of like, if we make space for us to know ourselves in the ways that we want to know ourselves and become the people who we are, then maybe that'll even change the relationship that we have to our own dreams and goals or immediate opportunities and projects that we pursue. I'm going to say one last thing because I'm realizing this connection kind of in real time. Several years ago, I think it was probably about 3 or so years ago, I was really seriously exploring the possibility of creating an alter ego. Not because I want to have a split, fragmented notion of self, but because a lot of people do it. Like artists have alter egos to sort of protect themselves from the hangups that make it really hard to put yourself really out there. And, Sasha Fierce or whatever else, like, a million of them. But the alter ego thing, I sat with it and I explored it a little bit and I was like, that feels so wrong to me because my work is the opposite of presenting as an alter ego. I'm trying to be me and I can't split myself any further. If anything, I'm trying to reconcile these differences between professional and personal or philosophical and political voices. And so I don't know, you're witnessing real-time connection of me revisiting that experience where I was like trying to really consider if I needed to have an alter ego to move through the work, and instead I did 2.5 years of therapy and now feel like I'm able to introduce myself as like a real, full, authentic version of who I not only know myself to be, but who I want to be too. And it's really exciting to be able to feel that shift, open up into a broader horizon of possibilities that I still don't know. It's still uncertain. It's still very much abyss-like of like the great unknown. No idea what's going to happen out there. But at least it I don't know how to describe it. It's just like a fundamentally different light. Sheen, tone, tenor, all of the above. So I hope that that's something. I'm going to be sitting with this more and more about this way of becoming who we are. But then the invitation of what it means to like be those people for ourselves and with each other, and coming out. Like, it maybe seemed a little silly to come out for my 40th birthday, but whether or not other people got it, it really is like to make it a true story. So now I can say I came out my 40th birthday and that's when everything changed. I don't know how it's going to change, but it wouldn't change with such drama if I didn't set it up in a meta way to be that on my birthday. And that's the spoiler for anybody who didn't know what I was really up to on my birthday, setting up meta truths and meta stories for the unfolding. Okay, I'm going to end there. Thank you so much for joining, for listening, for being a part of this journey. I'm really, 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 really happy to be thinking about the past 6 months. I hope you're doing the same. Astrologically, of course, this is a good time to be reviewing what happened in the past 6 months. We just had a Capricorn full moon, and now Mercury is retrograde in Cancer. And so that for me means I'm reviewing all of my creative projects that I've done and really trying to figure out like how to distill it so that I move forward with purpose on what I actually want to pursue. So I'm so thrilled. I'm excited. July is going to be big. August is probably going to be big too, but I'm just going to try to push through July. So see you soon. Thank you for being here. Check out my Buy Me a Coffee for Romance and Revolution stuff. I will have the PDF of that complete set up and available soon. And yeah, until then, be well. Thank you. Bye.